أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu ala al-Husayn wa ala Ali ibn al-Husayn wa ala awlad al-Husayn wa ala ashab al-Husayn. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sorry about the formatting. This is going from Mac to PC. So we are now at the 5th lesson in the lessons in Islamic doctrine, and this lesson is entitled Knowing God. Okay. So maybe quickly we go over the outline of this lesson, and then we go into a few points before we actually get into the lesson. So the manner in which the lesson is structured is that there's a quick introduction in which the author tells us we have finally reached the big question. So all the lessons that we've had so far were more of an introduction and premises, covering premises, before we reach the actual topics that are usually covered in theology, in ilm al-kalam or aqaid. So everything we've covered so far was more of a, let's call them preliminary introductions that are very important, but they're usually not covered in belief lessons. After that, the author goes into a distinction between two big types of knowledge. The first being knowledge by acquisition or acquired knowledge, al-ilm al-husuli, and the second one is called knowledge by presence or existential knowledge, al-ilm al-huduri. And then he talks a little bit about what we can call instinctive knowledge, which we can translate as ilm fitri. And then there's kind of his general conclusion that opens up to the next lessons. So before going into his introduction, I thought that because he doesn't do it in the lesson, and since there was a little bit of a break for a few weeks, I thought that I would at least try to get the main point on which he's drawing for this lesson from the previous lessons. So we're not going to summarize all the points from the previous lessons. We're just going to go directly to the point that is most relevant for today's lesson and moving forward. So in the first lesson, we spent a little bit of time making a distinction between two kinds of worldviews. We explained the difference between a worldview and an ideology, or what we called a metaphysical position and a praxis. And he made a distinction between what he considers a divine or religious or theistic worldview and everything else, which he lumped together under the general heading of materialistic worldview. So the non-deistic, non-theistic, non-religious worldview. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Keep that distinction in mind. There can only be two big worldviews, religious and non-religious, or divine and non-divine. From lesson 2, that's point from lesson 1. Lesson 2. We spent a little bit of time discussing the necessity of looking into religion. And one of the points that we tried to make is that there's a universal sense that we find in every human being that we can refer to as a religious sense. You go throughout history, you go through from one culture to another, you see that human beings always recognize a need for the sacred and for religion and for attachment with the metaphysical or supernatural or the divine. So that was from lesson 2. From lesson 3, we spent a little bit of time on the idea of what constitutes the perfection of a human being. And the conclusion from that was to say that the higher a human being, the more a human being behaves in a rational manner, the more their praxis or their ideology is derived from a very clear, coherent worldview, and they control their impulses and they manage their impulses through their reason, the more we can say that that human being is being a human, as opposed to being another type of creature. And then, from the last lesson that we covered, we went a little bit more into the types of knowledge that we can have. Today, in a certain way, this is going to be a continuity from that lesson. That's why I was on the fence on whether to put this lesson as part of the previous group of lessons or this upcoming one, and the case can be made for both. So in the last lesson, before the lesson where we summarized everything, we said that there can be four big categories, four types of knowledge. We talked about the scientific one, we talked about the devotional one, which we said usually comes from a religious background, so you follow it almost blindly because you have faith. The scientific or experimental one that is based on sense perception, that is very, very commonly used today as the one by default almost. And we spoke at length about the mystical worldview, the mystical approach to knowledge and the worldview that comes out of it, and we spent a lot of time criticizing it, not in itself, but saying that it's not sufficient if we want to build a rational worldview for ourselves and for others. And so the conclusion of that lesson was that if we are to engage and have a worldview with a coherent system of action that comes out of that worldview, then it needs to be based on a rational approach. The beginning, the starting point needs to be rational, or what we refer to, based on the terminology of the book, on the philosophical approach. So these are the points that constitute almost the premises for today's lesson. So, as we said, the lesson starts with an introduction. So until now we said there are two big worldviews. There's one that is theistic or divine or religious, and the materialistic one. He says that we have now reached the big question. Everything we've said so far really can fall into a general category that we've talked about, or a general field called epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. So what can a human being know? What's the best approach to know what they can know? How do you assess that type of knowledge? What are the tools you need to get to it, and so on and so forth. All the questions that we talked about fall in that kind of category. So now that we've said what we've said so far, we reach a point where we have to ask the first big question. Why is this the big question? Because depending on the answer we're going to get here, and we've tried to establish the approach we're going to follow to get that answer, everything is going to change. So either we're going to fall into the materialistic worldview and everything that comes out of that, or we're going to fall into the religious worldview and everything that comes out of that. So before anyone talks, let's say, about the attributes of God, what kind of knowledge does God have? Or is God just or not? And so these are, for instance, the issues of the problem of evil in the world, and is there one religion or more? That's pluralism, for instance. Did God send messengers or not? What's the nature of the divine message that was sent? Is there an afterlife or not? These all become secondary questions to this one. We have to start with this one, which is, can we prove, show, demonstrate the existence of a God first? And once this is established, then this is going to lead us into a completely different track. So all the questions, all the lessons, all the topics that we're going to cover are going to be a derivative of this one here. That's why this is considered the big question. And this is the first one that we encounter when we study theology. This is the first theological question. And the reason why I said that it's a fork in the road is because depending on the answer that we're going to get here, as we said, everything is going to change. So the worldview that we're going to have, the interpretation of the world that we're going to have is going to be different. Maybe this is more of a methodological remark about this lesson. So one way to look at this lesson is to see it as completing what we've been talking about, which is the theory of knowledge, the kind of knowledge we can have. And you'll see that basically this lesson can be presented as completing the types of knowledge discussion that we started. So in reality, the types of knowledge that we're going to address today should come before the ones that we talked about. But I'm following the order of the book. And there is a reason he's presenting it this way. He's going with what people are accustomed to, which is what we presented, and this one is considered a bit more of a specialized, a little bit more of a technical approach, so he presented it second. And this is a better transition for the actual topics that we're going to be addressing in the next lesson. So it makes sense to present it the way he has. But logically, this lesson, the topics of this lesson should have come before, because the split, the types of knowledge that we're going to see today, that split should come before the four that we talked about. Those become a second level of splitting the types of knowledge into scientific, devotional, mystical, and rational. So on one level, it's completing epistemology. But on the other side, we can see this as the real first lesson, allowing us to enter into the theological questions per se, proper. And that's why we can lump this lesson more into this group of lessons that we're about to start now. Types of knowledge. So let's take an example before we go into this very quickly. And I put it at the end, but I'll cover it very quickly. So just so that you keep it in mind as we explain the difference. Let's say any of us, we get sick and we go see a doctor. So we're feeling what we usually describe as symptoms or side effects of our illness. I'm the one feeling the pain. Let's say it's a headache or some sort of pain in my stomach or my back. So I go and I describe that to the doctor, the physician, who spent a lot of time studying this in theory. And maybe and maybe not, he's actually experienced the same thing or something similar in his life, so he has some sort of analogy, or not. When I describe it to him, I'm the one feeling what I'm feeling. What I'm feeling does not actually go to him. What goes to him is his understanding of what I'm explaining, which is a feeling. What he gets out of it is a mental image, based on his studies, it's a deep mental image. He knows more about it in theory than what I know, but he's not feeling what I'm feeling. So keeping that example in mind, we're now going to go into the two types of knowledge that are the crux of this lesson, and then we talk about the third that falls into the second type of knowledge presented here. So the first type of knowledge that the author talks about is al-ilm al-husuli, so acquired knowledge, knowledge that you acquire. And this can be translated in all sorts of ways, and if you go through different books and literature, you'll see that it has been translated in different ways. The literal translation would be acquired, as I used, husul, so you acquire something. Theoretical knowledge is a very good translation for this. More technically, the proper way to describe it, based on the explanation we're going to give, is mediated knowledge. This is a knowledge that you get through an intermediary. And the intermediary is, so now we're going to jump into another field in Islamic sciences, logic. In logic, they say you can know something either unmediated or mediated. Either there is an intermediary or there is no intermediary. What is that intermediary? It's the mental image, or what we can refer to as an idea, or a notion, or a concept. You make that idea in your mind based on your life experience, based on your, but it's a theoretical understanding of something. So the mental image is your intermediary. You look at a tree, you close your eyes, and you can see the image of the tree in your mind. It's not the tree itself that's present to your mind. It's the image that you have made of the tree in your mind. This is a mediated type of knowledge. There's an intermediary between you and the known. The known is the tree. The intermediary is your mental image. So the doctor, when he understands what you're saying, he's creating, or he's referring back to a mental image of your pain. He's not going to your pain itself. Your pain does not reappear in him. An image of your pain, a theoretical understanding of your pain, appears in his mind. So, based on this and we're not going to spend too much time. This can be this is a very extensive topic in Islamic philosophy, in Islamic beliefs, in Irfan and mysticism, and so on and so forth. And I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end. But maybe a couple of traits of this type of knowledge to keep in mind as we move forward, because we're going to need them later. The first one is that this type of knowledge is always open to doubt and questioning and the possibility of mistaking. It might be right, it might be wrong. Because it's a mental image that you construct based on a lot of things. It's not simple, it can be complex. So the complexity is you accumulate one image over another to create more complex notions. Those notions, if one of them is mistaken, then everything that ensues is going to be mistaken as well. Okay? So this is an important point. A lot of doubt, a lot of questioning, and so on and so forth around everything related to acquired knowledge or theoretical knowledge. Okay, so I think I'll stop here for the acquired knowledge. The second one, I put a few translations here. It's al-ilm al-huduri. So we've referred to already to this in the previous lessons as experiential knowledge, as direct knowledge, as witnessing or spiritual witnessing. In more advanced philosophical works, sometimes they say it's knowledge by presence or in presentia, as opposed to at the top you can see in absentia. So the thing in itself is absent, but an image of it is present. In this case, obviously, the thing in itself is going to be present. So this is no longer a mental image. What are examples of this? And then we go to a little bit of the traits. Example of this, for instance, is my knowledge of my own existence. So here I added one little, I don't know if it shows here, it's supposed to be an asterisk at the end. This type of knowledge, this is something that's very rarely mentioned, but it's very important. This type of knowledge is always accompanied by a mental image, but it is not the mental image. Example, let's say I feel angry, or I feel sad, or I feel in love. The feeling that I have is unmediated. I have direct access to it. This is not a mental image. There's no intermediary between me and my feeling. My feeling is directly accessible to me. But at any time, this weird, incredible ability of our mind can take a picture, a mental image of this feeling, and I can refer to it at any time. So if I want to, I can remember the notion, the image of my anger, the image of my sadness, without feeling the sadness itself. And this sometimes creates confusion. Because I'm looking at the image of what I felt, I think I'm actually referring to the image. So it creates confusion, alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah, between the thing that I'm accessing unmediated, the thing in itself that is present to me, and the image of it. So I'm mentioning this, keep it in mind, just so that we avoid confusion. But generally speaking, this type of knowledge is the type of knowledge we have about things in themselves as they are accessible to us without intermediary, without the need for a mental image. For instance, my existence. For instance, my moods, my feelings. Yeah, we can talk a lot more. I mean, I feel that I have will. I feel that I can think, and I can distinguish between thinking and, let's say, moving my hand. My awareness that I have these two different faculties is not a mental image of my faculty. It's a direct access to my faculty. And of course, I can create a mental image of that distinction. Okay, I don't want to go into more than that. I think it should be pretty clear. So if we go back to the example of someone who has an illness going to a physician, then this is the person feeling the pain. The pain itself, as it is being felt by the patient, by the person who's sick, that's the ilm huduri, that's the knowledge by presence. the illness, the pain, whatever they're feeling, that's present to them right now without any intermediary. Okay, why are we talking about all of this? The point here is that we're talking about the types of knowledge that we can have of God. This is an introduction to the proofs of the existence of God that we're going to start in the next lesson. So the author is starting by saying knowledge in general, if you study it, knowledge as knowledge without anything else, just knowledge, if you look at it philosophically or from logic, is of two types. If you look at your life, just like the example we just gave, when you know something, you can know it in one of two ways. Either it's an acquired knowledge with an intermediary, it's a mental image of something, or the thing in itself is present to you. That's the reason we're talking about this. This is going to be the introduction to getting into the next part of the lesson, which is existence of God and the proofs of the existence of God. So I hope that until now, the link between what we've said in the last lesson is starting to become a lot more clear. This is when we talked about the different approaches to knowledge, one of them being the mystical one. And we said in the mystical knowledge, those who follow the mystical knowledge towards God, they do not want the theoretical knowledge. They're not looking for notions and reason and understanding. They're looking to experience God, right? So when we apply all of this to God, if we say we want to have knowledge of God through the first type of knowledge, which is knowledge by acquisition, with an intermediary, what does that intermediary look like? It looks like what we're doing right now, which is you build based on reason, you build arguments, rational proofs, demonstrations, you study them, you argue them, and it's all based on reason and logic, or philosophy. This is the acquired knowledge, if you want to approach God through this means. And that's exactly what we're doing. So the entire field of ilm al-kalam, or aqaid, is based on this. The second type of knowledge, which is the knowledge by direct experience. You experience God directly. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a direct attachment to God. You feel God's presence directly. This is no longer a theoretical notion that you have. You feel that you are in the presence of God, or in the presence of certain of God's attributes. That's why the way it's explained here is more of a spiritual witnessing. Sometimes it's referred to as kashf or shuhud, and that terminology is all explaining this second type of knowledge that usually has nothing to do, we'll come back to that point, has nothing to do with the theoretical understanding of God. For this second type of knowledge, do you need a rational background? Do you need to establish arguments that you build based on logic and say there's a logical fallacy here, there's a mistake in the argument? No. It's something that you experience directly, just like you experience pain or love or sadness or your own existence. There's no mental image of what you're experiencing. What's the problem with this one? So I'm not going to repeat everything we've covered already in the previous lesson. So for that, I'm going to refer you back to lesson 4. If you want to, we talked at length about, generally speaking, the mystical approach. In itself, nothing wrong with it, but it has shortcomings from a methodological point of view if you want to build a worldview, both for yourself and for others, which is important in a belief system. And we can come back to that. More than all of that, if we want to add to all of that, one of the issues with this is that this is not accessible to the commoners. 99.9% of people will not be able to get to this level of experiential knowledge. And the reasons require a lengthy study to explain why. But the way we've explained it until now, so I'll just refer back to that a little bit and add to it, is that really, if you agree that this is a valid type of knowledge, which we do, it requires two big things. One of them is you actually do need a very strong theoretical knowledge. That's one, and I'll come back to that point. The second one is that we believe for this to be valid, you need to have the highest level of spiritual purity. If either one of these is missing, that knowledge is not going to be the correct type of knowledge. And this is what we believe is the case, let's say, of messengers, for instance, or infallibles. They have both of these. The first one, however, for the commoner, people like me, if I want to reach that kind of knowledge, I have to actually work very hard on that theoretical aspect, and then God will help me. If I'm actually doing everything right, God will help me with that theoretical component. But when that theoretical component is coming from God, instead of spending 20 years where I may or may not reach the truth theoretically, God may give it to me in an instant. And that's why when you go, let's say, to an imam or a prophet and you ask them about God, there is an aspect of it that is, yes, that's what they feel and no one else feels what they feel. This is something they experience. But they can still give you a sermon at the highest level of what today we call philosophy and reasoning, all built on logic, which tells you that the rational component, the theoretical component is valid. It's logical, it's coherent, it's well put together, and it's extremely advanced. It's very rich. We find this in the Holy Quran, we find this, let's say, in the sermons of the Imams, the Holy Prophet. This is very present, which tells us that the theoretical component is there. It has to come somehow. For the commoner, for me, for this theoretical component to be given to me, I have to work very hard. So what's the percentage of people who are going to be able to combine valid theoretical work for many, many years to be very advanced, combined with that spiritual purification required to reach valid experiential knowledge of God? And so we say very, very, very few. Sometimes when they refer to them, they say, for instance, that those are the theosophers, right? People who are specialists in theology and philosophy and spiritual purification and so on and so forth. So by, let's say, normal human standards, when you look at the lives of those people, you see that they spent a very long time perfecting the theoretical background as well as the spiritual background. So when you put that together, you say, okay, this is not really accessible to most people. So knowledge of God through this means, through spiritual purification and very strong theoretical validity of your information, is starting to become very rare. So we can't really rely on it as the main way to reach knowledge of God. It's not realistic to expect that the majority of people to rely on this type of knowledge to go towards God. Second point, and there's a few of them, but we're going to limit it to these 2 or 3. The second one is that it may be too weak. So those who spend enough time, you're going to get glimpses in your life. You're going to get a taste of what it is we're talking about when we say experiential knowledge of God. You may have an experience here or there. There are nights in the month of Ramadan, for instance, or you have some spiritual states, you go to a sacred place, you go to the pilgrimage, you feel something that you've never felt before, you know that you're having, in one way or another, it's a religious experience that you're having. But can you say, I can live my whole life based on that religious experience? That's why we say it's too weak. It's not clear enough what's happening to you. It's difficult for you to interpret and analyze what's going on and then build your life around it. It doesn't happen enough. If it happens, it's not clear enough, so it's too weak. It's not frequent enough. So before we say I'm going to build my life on this, you have to tell me what this is. How valid, how strong, how solid, how consistent is it? Yeah.
Isn't that, though, some sort of inspiration to get people to go on that path of more knowledge, if they do get those little bits of the spiritual bursts, so to speak?
Yes, absolutely. It's a valid one. The point is, can I say that my knowledge of God only rests on this glimpse this little taste that I got in that one little experience that I had 3 years ago, let's say. The issue is there. The issue is not that this is valid or not valid. Inshallah, this was a valid experience. But can you build your knowledge of God based on that one experience? Was it strong enough? Was it clear enough? Was it consistent? Was it frequent? Was it something that you can say, and therefore I can now build my knowledge of God, like we're going to explain in many, many lessons, and this is a summarized version of theology that we're covering here, and yet we're going to take lessons to talk about only the proofs of the existence of God, and then some of his attributes, and not really even going into depth in any of them. So before I say, let's say, I understand God's knowledge through my experimental or experiential experience, what's my experiential experience? How does it allow me to understand God's knowledge, let's say? Is it really good enough to replace 3 volumes that I may cover in the classic theory of Kalam, let's say, in where I get the proper understanding of God's knowledge? This is the issue. So the validity is there. Is it enough to build an entire system of faith on, is the question we're trying to answer. And until now, we haven't been able to see that we can do that. This is the part that's missing. Yeah, for the rest, I think I'm going to refer you back to lesson 4, where we talked a little bit more about this type of knowledge. Okay. And then the author goes into a third type of knowledge. This one he refers to as the instinctive knowledge. So what is instinctive knowledge? This is a reference to something we hear a lot, especially in our religion, but we hear it elsewhere as well. In our religion, the word is very clear, so we should all know it. It's fitra. Okay, so fitra, or something that is fitri, we can translate it as something that is instinctive, something that is natural. What does it mean? It means that it's something by its very definition, is in a certain way, has certain traits, behaves in a certain way, has certain functions, by its very definition, by its very nature. You don't need a further explanation. Whiteness is white. You don't need more explanation of why it's white. By definition, it's white, right? So when we say that something is instinctive, all we mean is that it is so by its very nature. So if we say something is instinctive to a human being, it's fitri to a human being, what we're saying is that it is so because of the very nature of being human. Nothing more. It's not more complicated than that. So the author gives us 3 big traits that he uses to say, let's assess, this is going to help us assess if something is fitri, is instinctive or not. Before we say something is fitri, it has to meet these criteria. And there are others, but he lumped them into those 3 general ones. The first one is that for something to be fitri, it needs to be universal. It needs to be found in every individual in that species. If I say something is instinctive or natural to this type of tree or plant, I have to be able to see it in each individual in that species. If I say something is fitri to human beings, it needs to be present in every human being. And if it is not, then this is the anomaly, and I need an explanation for that. If I don't have an explanation, I have a problem. I just broke the rule. I can't say that this is by nature, by definition, by instinct. Second group, so regardless of, let's say if we're talking about individuals, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of age, it needs to be present. Second, let's call it condition or criteria. It needs to be found across space and what he concentrates on, time. In other words, if I go back in history, as far back as I can go, I need to be able to see the same trait present. And if at some point it disappears, then I can no longer say that this is an instinctive, natural trait, a trait that is, by definition, found in all human beings. Third one, it cannot be a matter of teaching. It It cannot be a matter of learning. If I have to teach you something, that something cannot be instinctive because it requires teaching. It's no longer by your very nature that you know it. No one needs to teach you that when you get hungry you want to eat. That's not something you teach. I can teach you details about it, but the feeling itself has to be instinctive, natural for me to say this is instinctive by your nature, by definition of being a human. So that's the point here, variance in intensity. Yes, two people can have very varying degrees of intensity of something that they feel. So in this case, for instance, you can learn something a lot more than someone else. You can learn to use an instinct a lot more than someone else. Or in one person you see that it's very, very weak, in another it's a very, very strong one. You can work on that. You can polish it. You can foster a talent or an instinct that you have or a trait that you have as a human being. But it cannot be to the point where it's just not there, completely inexistent. So that's the first three criteria. And then he splits them, he lumps them into two. He says if we go into those instincts that we find in human beings, we see that they fall in two big categories. Some of those instincts have to do with knowledge. For instance, your instinct, your instinctive knowledge of your own existence. That falls in the category of knowledge. Things you're aware of. It's cognition, but it's instinctive cognition. It's natural cognition. It's not something you need to go to school to learn. You have it by your very nature. The other group, the other category of instincts are the ones that fall under the heading of your faculties that make you lean towards something or to another, which he has called desires, appetites, things like that. These are your other instincts. They make you move in a direction or another in life. They make you attracted to something or repulsed by something. So this is the second category of instincts. So if we were to take an example, let's say we take someone wants to say the love of a mother for her child is instinctive. Okay, so we have to go through the criteria. Is it found in every mother or not? And if it is not, then you have to give me a good explanation why it's not. Something that does not break the rule. So you say that's an anomaly, you can explain it with, let's say, a psychological disease, a problem. Okay, then we can say there is something of a rule that this is universal, found in every mother. Okay, is it found regardless of time? If I go back 10,000 years in history, do I still find mothers loving their children? Or does the situation change because of space or because of time? Say, no, it still works. Good. Third criteria. Is it something that I have to teach a mother to love her child? Or is it something natural in her that does not really require teaching? Say, no, it's not something I need to teach her. Instinctively, naturally, she is going to love her child. Of course, here we can say, yeah, and a mother may decide to take a course to love her child better or differently. Yes, that's a matter of intensity and degree. Of course you can do that. It doesn't mean that it's not naturally there. It means you're just polishing it. You're intensifying it. You're working on it, but it's there. And again, it would have to fall into one of these two. So, if we want to apply this to attachment of God, to God, the human being's attachment to God, can we say that it's natural, instinctive, or not? So we go and apply the same criteria. Is it found in every individual? The claim that we made, and we made it in lesson 2, is that it is. And if we rely on psychology, and there are many psychologists who say this, and we said they refer to this as the religious sense, the need of a human being for the sacred and for meaning related to the sacred in their life is present in everyone. That's the general idea, and this is what the author relies on. Then the claim is, it is. The Islamic theory is that it is. The Quranic theory is that it is. This is present in every individual. And this is the entire theory of fitrah of the Quran and of Islam. Okay, so the claim is that it is. This requires an extensive study on what fitrah actually means and how was it embedded in human beings. There are verses of the Quran that seem to refer to that. So, but this requires an extensive study. Inshallah, one day we'll get into that. Is it found if we go back in history? Yes, I think that one is very clear, very easy to establish. The further back you go in history, the more you see presence of religion and attachment of human beings to religion. Now, of course, some anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists have explained this as being just primitive versions of the human mind and so on and so forth, and as scientific advances are made, all of that is going to go away. We're not there yet. The majority of human beings on earth today are still believers attached to God and to religion. But that's their claim. Is there a question?
Sort of, but it has to do with filter.
Okay.
So a little sidetrack here. So I was looking at a lot of psychological theories, development and instinct, and when it came to the Islamic perspective, it always looked at how filter can be looked at even beyond the time of the womb. So how, you know, how Sigmund Freud looks at how early childhood trauma and experiences could really impact you as a grown-up. The Islamic perspective, well, it could even go back further than just the womb. So early experiences during that time and space could also impact us today. So I don't really have a question, more of a comment/question. How does that kind of play into this here?
I'm just going to plant a seed for now, and inshallah maybe we can get back to it, or you can read more up on it. But this is related to what's usually referred to as the whole idea of alam al-dhar. So the world before this one. This world is not a world that happens before this one in time. Definitely not. So if you go to theories like that of Mullah Sadra or that kind of philosophy, they explain that it happens before in terms of, let's call it, order. So in order, if I go back, let's say we talked a little bit about this, I think, I don't remember, probably in lesson 2. We said that according to Carl Jung, he says that if you go to the innermost depths of a human being, what you find is God. So this is, of course, the opposite of what Freud says, or Freud says that is the case, but you can get rid of that if you can become more mature, more sophisticated, more evolved. Carl Jung says the opposite, like, no, that's actually what you're supposed to find there. So where did this come from? So this idea of alam al-dhar is explaining to us where did this fitra come from. So we have verses like the one in Surah Al-A'raf that says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took a covenant from all human beings before this world. This is the idea. And the covenant was that, am I not your Lord? And they said, yes. And he told them, don't forget that. I'm going to ask you on the day of judgment about this. This, basically, the idea that it's giving us is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is instilling, embedding, anchoring in us before we come into this world. He is hardwiring us into believing in Him. This is a hardwiring that is taking place that we can refer to as alam al-dhar. We can, sometimes, I don't know, sometimes it's translated, I guess, as the world of particles, or, you know, basically before we were human beings, before we started our life here, pre-embryonic, pre-fetal world. Okay? So this is not talking about an actual material world. It's talking more about the nature of a human being. Where does it come from? So a part of that, where we need to understand that, is in the story of Adam and Eve and our relationship with the good and the evil in the world. That's one place where we can understand that. And the other one is in these verses that talk about the pre-world, let's call it. And what's, you see, the questions, the relationship that we have is all about embedding the notion of tawheed in a human being before he comes to this world. And here, your task then becomes to remember that, which was supposed to be my final thoughts today. And I'm starting to run out of time. So it's a very important, very good point. More reading and more talking, inshallah, in the future about that. Yes?
What's the exact difference between instinctive and potential or existential knowledge? I get confused when you talk about them two different, other like a branch, or is it like a complete separate?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think, I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but I'll say it right now. The author is presenting these as 3 types of knowledge of God. As acquired knowledge, experiential knowledge, and instinctive knowledge. The reality, though, is that and he does this in his other books, it's just this one is not advanced enough for him to get into the details, and others do that as well. Instinctive knowledge is a type of experiential knowledge. It's a branch of it. It's one type of experiential knowledge.
Just see that it's innate in you, it's inside you.
Exactly.
It can be or it cannot be. You can get it later, right? But it could experience.
It's there. It's there, but you're, yeah. And this is the role of religion, and this is the role of prophets, and this is the role of reason, to take it out of you fully, and not leave it at the stagnant, premature phase remaining in you, and you do nothing, inactive state in you.
So a recognition of that rather than a discovery.
Both, yes.
Both.
Unearthing.
Both.
Imam Ali says you unearth it.
Yeah.
Right.
The role of prophets is to unearth dafa'in al-uqul, what the things, that the intellects or the reasons that have been buried. The role of messengers is to unbury them, to take them out. That's the role of religion. That's the role of prophethood and messengers. That was supposed to be, again, the concluding. Okay, so this conclusion is more about what we've covered until now. Big points. Can we rely on the experiential knowledge to build our entire knowledge about God or not? Realistically, no, we can't. It's not sufficient for the great crushing majority of human beings. It's not enough. Instinctive knowledge. Can we rely on it or not? The problem, the good thing, is that it's present in everyone. So is our claim, so is the claim of our religion, so is the claim of the author. We think, we believe that it's present, and we have evidence that it's present in everyone. The issue is not there. The issue is that, is it clear enough in everyone? Can we say that it's clear enough in all of us? No, it's not. So we cannot use that as the main criteria, main foundation, main background on which we can build our entire structure of knowledge about God. I'm just thinking about this last point. We can talk a lot about this last point. For the proper use of anything that is instinctive, you need to go educate yourself. You need to build a strong theoretical foundation about what that means to have this instinct or that instinct. It does require theoretical knowledge. So just because something is natural doesn't mean that you can use it as is without thinking about it, reading about it, educating yourself about it. And if you think about your life in general, think about anything that's supposed to be natural, instinctive to you, you'll see that you can use that instinct in you a lot better, a lot more efficiently, a lot more productively if you educate yourself theoretically about it. Let's say sleep. Yeah, sleep is a natural thing, but there's a whole science now about sleep. You can sleep better. You can sleep deeper. You can make your sleep a lot more productive. You can say the same thing about eating, drinking, anything that falls under the natural, instinctive category. It doesn't mean that if it's instinctive, it stops there. So even if we say knowledge of God is instinctive, it doesn't mean it doesn't need a theoretical background and that we can't make it more intense and more clear without a lot more theoretical foundation. That's all I'll say for this one. A few personal remarks. This was what was covered in the lesson. This is going now beyond the lesson. So the first one was supposed to be for your question about, is knowledge that is instinctive a different type of knowledge than knowledge that is by presence or huduri? No, it's not. The reality is it's a type of it. So instinctive knowledge is one type of experiential knowledge. It's just weaker than what's usually referred to in the mystical approach. They don't refer to the instinctive part, but it is instinctive. That's one type of it. So I think that was your question. The role of religion, as we said, so this was mentioned and we'll talk about it. This little quote here is a tiny one little line from the first sermon of Nahj al-Balagha from Imam Ali alayhi salam. I very strongly advise all of us to go back and read it slowly. The stuff you discover in that sermon is incredible. I don't think you'll see it anywhere else. Imam Ali alayhi salam describes right from the beginning what could be considered the deepest philosophical thoughts about the unicity, monotheism and unity of God. And then he goes into the creation of the world. He talks about different kinds of angels. He talks about how heaven and earth were created. And then he gets into Adam and Eve. And then he gets into the creation of human beings and why prophets were sent. And then you see this little line in there, which was a reference to what we talked about earlier, where he says, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent his messengers and series of his prophets toward human beings, to reanimate. That's how I translated it here, but it could mean also to excite, to activate, to unearth their intellects which have been buried. So why are they buried? They're buried because of this world. They're buried because of worldly things, because how easily human beings get distracted by things of their very nature, but it's only half of their nature, which is we're made of clay and sand and mud and earth, and so that's half of us, we lean towards that. And then there's a spiritual aspect to us, but that's not what we see, that's not what's common to us, so we get distracted from that. So the role of prophets is to remind us of that other one, that unseen one, the one that we don't taste and feel and experience daily. This is the point of religion and prophets and Quran and all of this. And this is why I wanted to talk about, but there's no time to talk about this in any detail. This is a gigantic topic in Islam, the topic of dhikr, which I just translated as remembrance. This is a huge philosophy in Islam that needs to be thought about. Why is it called dhikr? Why is the Quran called a dhikr? Why is it referred to as the remembrance? What are we trying to remember? What have we forgotten? So this is a reference to the fitrah. We have to link it to this notion of the fitrah. How are we created? What's hardwired in us that we're supposed to never forget and that we keep forgetting, and the whole point of our existence is to remember. Stop forgetting. Stop burying it. Take it out and remember it and keep it in front of you. And we keep forgetting, and we have to do things to keep remembering. So keep that in mind, think about it, look it up. So the next thing is ma'rufun 'inda kulli jahil. This is a little tiny part from a sermon from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, where he talks about God. And this is a little line where he says, he is the one who is known even by every ignorant. So this is just to give one more example, because maybe this is not something we hear a lot, this little part of the sermon. How the Islamic theory is based on the idea that knowledge of God is instinctive. It's natural. It's in all of us. So this is just one more reference from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, where he says even someone who is completely ignorant, immature, not knowledgeable, not knowing anything, still knows God. He might not know it's God, but he knows God. The link with the Quran, and this is more the part that I called the reflection or the homework. If you can, look these verses up. They talk about what we talked about, which is knowledge of God is instinctive, but from a very specific angle. The ones that I mentioned, there are many of them. These are a few. These talk about how a human being, when they are faced with huge struggles, with extreme struggles, suddenly they remember God. And they pray and beseech and implore. They remember God. The remembrance, that's the remembrance. So suddenly when you are put in that situation, and there are many verses in the Quran, for instance, that talk about if you are on a ship, when they are on a ship and then there's wind and there's a storm and they think they're going to die, they pray to God, and then when they reach the land, they become polytheists again. They ascribe partners to God again. What happened? Why do you fall back to that and you did not associate those associates to God when you were in your moment of dire need? What happened? And this is where you see that there is a human instinct. You push a human enough. This is what Carl Jung says when he says you go deep enough. This is going deep enough. You push that, you put enough struggle, you put enough difficulty on a human being, they have to fall back to what's most instinctive in them, All of psychology is based on that. This is the unconscious. The unconscious can become conscious. How? You have to find a way to get it out. And you get it out through putting them in an extreme situation, like a difficulty, like extreme fear, with your back to the wall. And then suddenly you resort back to your primal instinct, which is you pray to God. And then you fall back out of that situation, out of that state, and you resort back to your normal situation. So what happened there? Is this not proof that our attachment to God is instinctive? And then why does it only come out in the moment of struggle and extreme difficulty? And this is a question for all of us, because this is something we struggle with. The Quran says this is human nature. So what do we need to do to get out of that human nature? So that we are not of those who forget God unless we are in an extreme situation. What do we have to do so that we don't fall into this pattern of, I'm in an extreme situation, I remember God. He pulls me out of it, I forget Him. And then I have to wait until the next time I'm forced to remember Him. And the Quran is very clear on that. He says those who forget God, God makes them forget themselves. It's very scary. There's warnings around that. So what do we need to do to get out of that pattern? And then there's a link between that and the philosophy of struggle in Islam. And entire volumes have been written about this. How does Islam interpret struggle? Struggle can have it has a role to purify you as an individual. It has a role to purify you as a society and as a community. It helps you have more discipline and perhaps one of the factors that have to be taken into account in the philosophy of struggle in Islam is that it's maybe God's way of tough love forcing you back to reconnect with Him. Because that's what it takes for some people. To reconnect back to God is to put them through that kind of test. And so it becomes, in another way, you have to look at this as a kind of mercy. Had you not gone through that struggle, you would not have reconnected with God. He put you in a situation where these were your options. You completely forget God, or you reconnect with Him. So you have to interpret that as a kind of mercy. And then, very quickly, two points. The first one, the importance for theology. So this is more for the knowledge portion. The topic of the knowledge by presence is very important in Islamic theology. So to understand the role of prophethood or the messengers, how do they know what they know? Why are they infallible? What does it mean to say that someone is infallible? You need to understand this notion of knowledge by presence. So although it may seem like it's a dry topic today, very theoretical and abstract, we're going to come back to this one and we're going to use it a lot, especially when we go to issues of the questions or topics about prophethood and imamah. We're going to see how their knowledge differs from ours, and how we explain their knowledge and how we explain their infallibility through this type of knowledge that they have, which is knowledge by presence and not knowledge in theory about things. And then the last point that I would have is, I think for all of us, the importance of humility in our knowledge. When you start realizing that there's a different kind of knowledge out there, and that one cannot accept truth and falsehood. It's always true, because the thing is present in itself to you. I think we lose that feeling of arrogance that because I read 3 books and I know a few terms and specialized concepts that I have now real knowledge, as though I have now acquired some sort of divine merit. When in reality, this is just an accumulation of information which may or may not lead to something spiritual. There's another kind of knowledge. That's the one we should aspire to. A knowledge that we experience, and that one is transformative. That one changes your soul. That one opens doors to you because you see the world differently. So this is more, I guess, a call for myself and to anyone else studying religion, thinking that because you have acquired a few terms and read a few books that now you're something important and that you have real knowledge. This is not real knowledge. This is just an accumulation of information. A computer has a lot more than what you hold. So the merit is not in that. The merit is in the spiritual type of knowledge that you have, the one that elevates your soul. I think that's all we had. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.